Welcome to the Whitmercast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. My name is Katherine Pollock, and I am currently a master's student in religious studies at Missouri State University. I'll be your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. We have a great episode lined up for you today. We'll be talking with Joseph Spencer. If you'd like to join JWJ or visit our entire backlog of episodes and JWJ journals, go to jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started. Today, I have the pleasure of being joined by Joseph Spencer. He is a philosopher and associate professor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University. He is the current president of the Book of Mormon Studies Association and the former editor of the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies. He published the essay Books of Mormon, Latter-day Saint, lowercase d, Latter-day Saints, no hyphen, uppercase D, and the Book of Mormon, and the anthology Open Canon, Scriptures of the Latter-day Saint Tradition, which won the 2023 Best Anthology Award from the John Whitmer Historical Association. He also recently published A Word in Season, Isaiah's Reception in the Book of Mormon with University of Illinois Press. Joe, thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you. So, first of all, could you tell us a little bit about how did you get started on the path to become a scholar of the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, it's not what I set out to do, that's for sure. I My training's in philosophy, which was my primary academic interest, though it was always in some sense about thinking about the Latter-day Saint tradition in one way or another, theology or philosophy of religion or whatever. But I was always interested in scripture as both content of scripture and then like the idea of scripture. And a lot of what I studied in philosophy was about theories of interpretation and that kind of thing. And so along the way in graduate school, I did some writing about the Book of Mormon, and it was very well received, and it ended up sort of channeling where I went, right? I wasn't planning on that, but it happened that way. And when I landed at BYU, I teach in the Department of Ancient Scripture at BYU in Provo, Utah, and I came here basically to do Book of Mormon stuff. So now it's kind of my full-time gig. So yeah, not quite what I expected, but and I bring all the other things that I've been interested in to the Book of Mormon. I tend to read it philosophically or theologically, and try to put it in conversation with whether the larger philosophical theological tradition or other scriptures, other texts, and this kind of thing. So, yeah, it's been a weird path, but a good one.
So let's talk about your essay in Open Canon. So it compares the details of different Book of Mormon editions used by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Community of Christ. So what made you interested in doing a comparative project like that?
Yeah, I've been fascinated by the larger restoration tradition for a lot of years, and what originally drew my attention to it, just to like thinking about the other branches of the restoration than the one that is my own faith tradition, was that I there was some point at which I read the commentary by
Dale Luffman?
no earlier. It's on my shelf. Hartshorn, Chris Hartshorn. I read something from Chris Hartshorn's commentary on the Book of Mormon, and it was just so refreshing to read an approach to the Book of Mormon that was not informed by my own community, my own faith community. Right? I was like, oh, he's seeing all kinds of things in the Book of Mormon I don't naturally see. Right? And that sort of woke me up to the richness of the larger tradition of the Latter Day Saint movement, and made me realize, oh, this is really important. If I'm going to read the Book of Mormon well, I can't simply read it in the silo of one of the groups that reads the Book of Mormon as their scripture. And so that's what got me interested in the first place. So when Christopher Blythe invited me to be a part of this book project, I that was what I immediately thought of. Was I want to talk about the fact that there are kind of books, plural, of Mormon, right? Books of Mormon that sit in different faith traditions, and as a result, look different, feel different, have a different kind of meaning or bearing.
So what are the main takeaways you wanted readers to get from that chapter?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot that I try to look at there. There's a long history, of course, of publishing the Book of Mormon in both traditions. And there's some fascinating overlaps and then some really fascinating divergences. And so, if there's like one overarching thing I hope people would take away from reading that article, it's the kind of thing I was just talking about. I would hope people read it and say, oh, heavens, like there isn't just some object that is the Book of Mormon and it's always the same and it just means the same thing no matter what or something. And there's just one meaning of it. I would hope that they would come away going, oh, yeah, I've got to think I've got to be more aware of the situation in which I read, the tradition in which I read, and that it matters how the thing is packaged. What do footnotes do to you as a reader? What do headings do to you as a reader? How the table of contents is ordered. How does that affect you as a reader? So I hope if, at an overarching level, it just sort of makes people more aware as readers of scripture. But there's a bunch of particular things I hope people take away from it too, right? I really hope that there's something interesting in the fact, for instance, in the early 20th century, that the RLDS tradition at the time is, in a certain sense, very conservative with respect to the Book of Mormon. It's trying to go back and look at manuscript sources and give readings that are earlier and, in that sense, more faithful to what it is that Joseph Smith dictates to his scribes. Whereas the LDS tradition at that point is actually moving in a kind of liberal direction, right? James E. Talmage and his committee working on the 1920 LDS edition of the Book of Mormon are sort of experimenting with updating language a little bit and correcting grammar. So they're getting farther and away from Joseph Smith's original dictation. But then in the middle of the 20th century, or really this kind of the second half of the 20th century, you see that kind of reverse, right? In the face of what often gets called the New Mormon history, and the very beginnings of what has now become Mormon studies as a larger field, the RLDS tradition tends to get much more liberal with the Book of Mormon. They put out the revised authorized version and really modernize the date grammar and that kind of thing. While at that point, the LDS tradition does the kind of about face and gets much more conservative with the Book of Mormon and sort of insists on a version that's going to be truer to the original dictation. So it's I think is just a very interesting story that you have two traditions that are going in different directions at different times, and I think often you can show in response to each other. James E. Talmage is clearly looking at the 1908 RLDS tradition, or the RLDS edition, and Orson Pratt is clearly looking, when he's been working on his 1879 LDS edition, he's clearly looking at the 1874 RLDS edition, but also vice versa. It's, I think, a very interesting history. Neither tradition is working in a total vacuum, but also neither tradition is just sort of copying the other. It's a much more interesting and complex history. I hope that becomes clear, and I hope it spurs more work on that history. Honestly,
That's a great takeaway. Thank you.
yeah.
So next I'd like to talk about your newest book. So A Word in a Season, Isaiah's Reception in the Book of Mormon. You wanted to put together a comparative reception, so how did you lay that out?
Yeah, I mean, what I was trying to do, I've been working on questions of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon for a really long time. This is one thing I actually don't know about the larger history of Community of Christ's tradition here. I don't know how frequently there has been a kind of attempt in Community of Christ to create a literature surrounding Isaiah in the Book of Mormon, but in the Latter Day Saint tradition, the LDS tradition, that's gigantic, right? It's a cottage industry of publication. There's a kind of felt need at the popular level to figure out Isaiah and a really clear confusion about what on earth to make of Isaiah. And so, pretty early in my work on the Book of Mormon, I wanted to make sense of Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. Most often, when people have written about that subject, what they've done is examined what we can gather from biblical scholarship about the authorship of Isaiah and the history of its compilation and redaction and that kind of thing, and then ask what that might mean or not mean about the historicity of the Book of Mormon. Does it fit in the ancient world and this kind of thing? And for me, that's actually a very uninteresting question. I think I can see why people are interested in it, and I think it's not unimportant. But it has always felt to me like the least interesting question about Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. So what I was trying to do with this project was take the things I've found over years and years with Isaiah and the Book of Mormon and figure out two things. One, just what is Isaiah doing? Does it play a role in the organization of the Book of Mormon? Does it help in some way to contribute to the project that is the Book of Mormon, rather than just sort of being random quotations of Isaiah? And then, with that in mind, to ask the question of how the Book of Mormon reads Isaiah in comparison, and this is what you were asking, right? In comparison to the whole larger tradition of reading Isaiah. Of course, we've got 2,500 years of people trying to make sense of Isaiah in one way or another. And even in just the sort of narrow Protestant context of the last 500 years, so many different traditions of reading Isaiah, and so many different ways people have come at the prophet and his relevance, or the book and its parts and their relevance. So what I wanted to do was, given what the Book of Mormon is doing with Isaiah, if I'm right about those things, then how does the Book of Mormon compare? Is it particularly unique in, say, the 1830s? Would someone reading it in the 1830s read the Book of Mormon if they know how Isaiah is usually read in other contexts? Would they read the Book of Mormon and say, this is wacky? Or would they read the Book of Mormon and say, oh, yeah, this feels very familiar? So that's what I do in this book is I try to do this comparative reception question to say, how are Free Will Baptists reading Isaiah in 1829? And how different is that from what you find in the Book of Mormon? If we go and look at someone like Ethan Smith, who, of course, is using Isaiah and a lot of other biblical texts to talk about Native Americans and Israelite identity or something, does he read Isaiah in ways that are similar to or very different from the Book of Mormon? How would the Book of Mormon have felt when it first landed? And I think, at least for my money, I hope it's opened up a lot of possibilities for seeing interesting things going on in the Book of Mormon, and then seeing the Book of Mormon is offering some unique things to the conversation about how to read Isaiah or about what Isaiah might mean in the modern world.
So have you had any early reception since your book's been out for a little bit, or is this too soon?
It's a little soon. It's been out since November and we're in March. So I get a lot of like stray comments, but the reviews are still to come, kind of thing, right? I mean, there are a few reviews online on blogs and such like that. And so far, the reception has been very good. And I'm happy for that because sometimes writing about Isaiah in the Book of Mormon is a fiery conversation, right? And so I've been glad that it's been so far. It's gone very very well, but the jury is still out. We're still pretty early in this process, so we'll see.
What was the most challenging part of putting this book together?
Uh, yeah, I mean, it's two things in once. Like I said, right? It's on the one hand just figuring out what Isaiah is doing in the Book of Mormon, and that was challenging in itself, simply because that is not how basically anyone, at least in the Latter Day Saint tradition, has tried to read Isaiah in the Book of Mormon. The question has always been just like, what does it mean? What do these words mean? What are these weird references to these ancient nations or whatever it is? Or it's been people writing about that whole question of does it render the claim of the Book of Mormon to be an ancient text problematic or something, right? And so I had to kind of venture out into totally new territory to ask, like, is there a structure to, say, Nephi's project, and where does Isaiah fit into that structure? And if there is, what is Isaiah doing in that structure? Does that tell us something about how this is unfolding? Why does Abinadi, along with King Noah's priests, have to interact with Isaiah in the Book of Mosiah? Why is Jesus Christ in resurrected form interacting with Isaiah later in Third Nephi? So I had to ask a lot of questions, just like, what is it doing there? And that was literally a decade of work, right? Of just sifting and sorting and figuring out what role Isaiah is playing in the book and its construction. But in a lot of ways, that was easier because that's my day job than the other half of the project. In a lot of ways, the other half of the project was harder simply because I had to try to get into my head a 2,500-year history of how people have read Isaiah. And obviously, I didn't get 2,500 years of history in my head, but trying to get the big broad contours of that and trying to figure out who are the relevant voices and where are the margins and where are the central voices at which times and where are the big shifts, right? And when are there big methodological changes? And then it was very hard, especially to get a sense for how this all feels on the ground for average Americans who would have read the Book of Mormon in the 1830s. They don't tend to comment on the Isaiah stuff in the Book of Mormon directly, so I have to look at how they're talking about Isaiah in like the Baptist Magazine Quarterly and the like Methodist Review and things like this to kind of see how are average people grappling with Isaiah at the time, missionaries writing back to magazines and so on to report on things. So I get a sense of just how weird the Book of Mormon is or isn't. So it was a lot of reading for someone like me who is not trained in history. I mean, I read a lot, but it was a different kind of reading, digging through archives, looking at lots of primary sources. Philosophers like to just think with ideas and no sources at all. Right? So that was a lot of work and very hard work, but hopefully I've done my homework decently.
Is there anywhere you're hoping that the study of the Book of Mormon and Isaiah will go next?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say something that sounds really arrogant, I suppose. I really hope that with this book, I've kind of hit the reset button on Isaiah and the Book of Mormon. Like that sounds really arrogant, or at least I don't know, like grand or something, right? That, but it really has felt that way to me. That the the conversation that has gone on with the Book of Mormon and Isaiah over however many decades, even centuries, has mostly been beside the point. At least that's how it feels to me when I read what people have written. It's mildly interesting, but it doesn't get at like what is the Book of Mormon doing with this, and how weird is that, or how not weird is that. So I really hope I've, in some sense, said that here's a place to really start, so that we don't have to just have ongoing fights about first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and whether that ruins the Book of Mormon. Or I hope it kind of, yeah, we this is a baseline, and from here, I hope the conversation goes in lots of other directions. I don't know if I have any particular hopes. Like I really hope someone will do this or that, but I do hope that this becomes a kind of point of orientation, and that when we talk about Isaiah and the Book of Mormon going forward, we can, like scholars in general and even lay believers, can have a kind of sense of what Isaiah is doing in the book, and hopefully then that can get sharpened and improved or whatever, and maybe its place in the larger history of Isaiah reception can get sharpened and improved. But yeah, above all, I really hope we've just kind of said, okay, here's the starting place. What next?
So you've done these two projects. Where do you want your research to go next?
I mean, I'm working on some things right now. I'm working on a little book on Hugh Nibley. Hugh Nibley is probably the most famous apologist in the Latter-day Saint tradition. He's at his peak in the 1950s and 60s, though he doesn't die until 2005. And but he's a toweringly influential figure in the LDS context, in part because of his apologetics, but also in part simply because he was this polymathic genius, right? Regardless of whether one likes any of his conclusions, the guy spoke 22 languages. He was, I mean, it's just ridiculous kind of intellectual mind. And as a result, he's been so influential. He's also very famous for, in his last couple of decades of his life, being a kind of bombastically countercultural figure, right? Giving popular sermons, but like railing against LDS cultures of like wealth, and raging against anti-environmentalism and so on. So he's an interesting figure because he's very against the grain of sort of the mainstream conservatism of 1980s and 90s LDS culture, and he's gotten a lot of attention for that. So I'm writing a little book on him. It's for the University of Illinois series, Introductions to Mormon Thought. But I'm trying to figure him out because I think he's been read in a lot of ways that seem strange to me. So I'm trying to kind of reclaim him and rethink about him, and see what place he's had in the construction of thought within the LDS tradition, and his impact on other branches of the Restoration are also interesting to track. It's been fascinating as I dig around saying, oh yeah, he's showing up in commentaries by RLDS writers in the mid 20th century as well. Or, it's an interesting character. So I'm working on that, and then of course more generally, I'm always working on theological questions. So my project I'm hoping to do after that, that I've been gathering things for and reading for, is I want to think about a Latter Day Saint theology of baptism. To my knowledge, no one's ever written a Latter Day Saint theology of baptism. And it seems to me that the Book of Mormon has a lot of unique things it's doing with baptism. It's got a very peculiar set of notions surrounding Christ's baptism, and then has this pre-Christian baptism that arises in ways in the Book of Mosiah, and then has some other things I think that are very interesting. And then I want to tie this into a lot of Joseph Smith's own thinking over the course of his prophetic career. What's going on with the idea of baptism for the dead that Joseph Smith introduces in the Nauvoo period? But how do we make sense of some of the other things that Joseph Smith claims about baptism over the years? His idea of washings and anointings in the Kirtland Temple is some kind of a baptism, etc. So this is a project I'm looking at next. Is there a Latter Day Saint theology of baptism to draw out of the scriptures Joseph Smith gave to the world?
Well, that was my last question. Do you have any collaborators or special people you'd like to acknowledge or thank before I let you go?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I have good friends I work with all the time, that whether they co-author a paper or a book with me, are they're everywhere in it, right? Their fingerprints are all over these things and so on. So I really appreciate that question. I mean, the people I work the most consistently closely with would be Kim Matheson, Sharon Harris, and Adam Miller, good friends of mine, all working in the context of Latter-day Saint scripture and theology. And it's, yeah, they're lovely people to work with. And I often feel like I couldn't be a luckier person to have good colleagues that do really smart things and like working with me, apparently. So that's fun. It's a lot of fun.
Well, you've been very gracious with your time with us today. Well, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks. No, really glad to have done this.
We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmercast. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit www.jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association, all rights reserved.